Hello, 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 and welcome to episode 4 of Arbiter of Worlds. If you're a first-time visitor, Arbiter of Worlds is like divinity school for GMs. It won't necessarily make you a better preacher, but at least you'll be preaching about the right things. Today, I've got an episode of biblical proportions for you. Because as a GM, you are God. Or at least you're God of the world you've created. With pen and dice, you can raise and lower mountain ranges, you can bring ruin to great civilizations, change the climate, unleash catastrophes. Within the context of the game, you have all the powers worthy of the Old Testament. But sometimes, you have to set aside your godlike omnipotence to adopt another biblical role, that of Satan. In Hebrew, Satan is the word for adversary. And throughout the Old Testament tradition, the various military and legal adversaries of the characters are often called Satan. And the role of Satan in this tradition is always to test the protagonists to their fullest extent. Even though God, who created Satan in the first place and assigned him to this task, is secretly hoping the protagonist will succeed in overcoming these tests. Now, Satan's most famous appearance is in the book of Job as an agent of God whose role is to test the faith of the hapless hero. Satan afflicts Job with loss of family, loss of property, loss of health, all in order to tempt him to evil. But Job ultimately gains character in the face of this adversity. And the book of Job is illustrative of the appropriate relationship between your GM role as a whole and your specific role as adversary. As a game master, as God of the world you've created, you're also going to have created various agents. And you're going to use those agents, NPCs, as adversaries to test your players with various challenges. And when you play as the adversary, you challenge the players to the fullest extent. And sometimes, playing as the adversary, you might even defeat them. At the same time, you are still God, and so you're secretly hoping the players will succeed in overcoming these tests. And that leads to our first key point. Don't make the adversary into God. Making your adversary too godlike, too powerful, it's a huge mistake. God didn't give Satan the power to just arbitrarily kill Job, right? But all too often, GMs give their main adversaries the power to arbitrarily kill the whole party. And then when they don't kill the whole party, it begs the question, why didn't they kill the whole party? Now, we can't blame the GMs too much on this because a lot of games really contribute to this with imbalanced rules. Let's think about Sauron, the classic Dark Lord of fantasy fiction, and let's compare Sauron to an 18th level wizard in D&D. So Sauron wants to find the one ring that's been stolen from him. And in order to learn the name of the thief, the first level halfling thief who has his one ring, first he has to find Gollum, then he has to torture the name out of Gollum. He then has to have minions ride on horseback to the local village to ask around for this guy. And then when they think they find him, they actually have to break into his inn and stab him manually with swords, only to discover they just stabbed pillows. In contrast, your 18th level wizard in D&D is just like, I use discern location to find the ring, cast a quick teleport to its location, power word kill on Frodo, and take the thing. So Sauron is a demigod, but he's way less powerful than a standard D&D wizard of not even epic level. And that's really problematic if you want to create a villain in D&D or anything like it. Sauron is Satan, but an 18th level D&D wizard is too close to God. Now, if you're running a game with a power level like D&D, you owe it to yourself and to your players to come up with a justification why the villains don't just wipe out their opponents. And there's basically two explanations available to you. One, the adversaries for some reason don't actually have the power to dispatch the player characters. Or two, the adversaries are stupid. And unfortunately, stupidity is all too often the fallback that gets used, especially in commercial adventure scenarios. Now, the adventurer writers don't usually just flat out say, the villain is stupid. But instead they come up with some justification like this. The villain is overconfident and doesn't see the heroes as a threat. The villain is too important to be bothered by the heroes. The villain is distracted by more pressing challenges. The villain is toying with the heroes. Yeah, a villain who does any of those things is stupid and needs to reread the Evil Overlord checklist. Stupidity is just a suboptimal solution to this problem. It stretches the suspension of disbelief, it reduces the sense of accomplishment by the players when they realize they only won because your villains were dumbasses. It's why Obi-Wan Kenobi's victory over Darth Maul in Episode 1 and Anakin in Episode 3 is totally unsatisfying. Obi-Wan only won because the Sith Lords were dumbasses. So, leaving aside Darth Dumbass, let's think about Ariakas, right? The arch-villain of Dragonlance. According to Dragonlance 14, the Dragons of Triumph, Ariakas is a 23rd level cleric with 18 wisdom. This is essentially as wise as a man can possibly be in that edition of the game. And yet, according to Dragonlance 14, this is what they have to say about Ariakas. Ariakas is so confident of his supreme abilities that he has a tendency to be careless when estimating the strength of his enemies. He does not give them credit for their skills, and consequently his plans may contain flaws that clever opponents may capitalize upon. Okay, that's literally like the very definition of unwise. Carelessness when estimating your enemies and plans containing flaws. Basically, they're saying Ariakas is stupid. And he shouldn't be. Now, some villains actually should be stupid, of course. Right? Shout out to all my Ogre and Kobold fans out there. But if your villain is supposed to be an evil genius, you really should try to get rid of any stupid justification for his behavior. Okay, so if we aren't going to rely on stupidity, how do we keep our villains adversarial rather than godlike? And the first approach is to change the rules. In my fantasy rule set, Adventure Conquer King system, I substantially reduced the utility of all the detection and teleportation magic for all the characters for this very reason. Wizards are still deadly, right? They can blast lightning bolts, hurl meteor swarms, but they're not like magical spy satellites that can easily find people, And even if they can, there's no risk-free way to just beam across the continent. And that allows you to run axe campaigns, which can have highly powerful villains, but they're still localized in their scope of threat. And this approach works really well when you want to have a lot of villains within a confined geography, like a sandbox, and it makes hunt and fetch quests interesting again. The second solution to having a godlike villain is to begin your campaign with him somehow crippled at the outset. Over time, his power level increases towards his omnipotent baseline, but then so does the power level of the heroes. And the early books of the Wheel of Time series did this beautifully, right? With a series of seals being broken, and each break increases the power of the Dark One. And it's an approach that serves really well for games with a leveling mechanic, since you can build a story web where the danger from the villain scales up as the heroes move through the story web. And then the third method is to create a counterforce which checks the villain's power. I once used this approach in a superheroes campaign. The arch-villain could telepathically locate and kill anyone on the planet, which is kind of a potential problem for a superheroes campaign since she could have just, killed everybody in episode 1. So my solution was to have an NPC mentor with precognitive powers that functioned with more precision from imminent and closely tied threats. So this made it impossible for the Archvision to directly attack the party without giving away her intent and location. And so as a result, the villain is forced to use convoluted plans that never directly aim at confronting the heroes. And these plans were maddeningly fun for me to concoct, and they were fun for the players to unwind. Now let me pause here for a caveat. If I hadn't limited the precognitive mentor's powers to being tied to specific imminent threats, I'd have created a godlike problem in reverse. How do you challenge a party that knows everything? So you always need to be careful that in solving one problem, you don't accidentally create another. All right, I'm going to close out this video with a parable. Once upon a time, there was a wise king who was concerned that his son lacked the moral character to rule. As a biblical scholar, the wise king was familiar with the book of Job, and he decided that he would test his son's character just as God had tested Job's character. So the king found the most beautiful courtesan in his harem, and he commanded her to seduce his son. And to make the test challenging, he told her that if she seduced his son, she would get to become queen. So she's obviously very motivated to succeed. And so the courtesan uses all her charms, all her wiles on the hapless prince, but ultimately she fails. The prince does not fall for it. And the king is delighted. And that's the lesson of this parable. That's the lesson for game masters. While you might play the courtesan, you are the king. That is to say, you don't really want to screw your players. You just want to test their characters. And that's all for today. Check back next week for more parables of game mastering. Before you go, please make a critical hit on the like button and then cleave over to the subscribe button. We'll see you next week.